Okay, so Doug is just setting everything up here and he'll let us know when. All right, we're going live on YouTube now with the card. Okay, started.
Okay, I started the webinar. Everyone's coming in and we're getting ready to go. The live stream is up and we'll spotlight over to Anna at the top of the hour.
Thank you both for accepting our invitation to be here. It's exciting.
All righty, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Emancipatory Content, Connections and Experiences for the Future of Education. We are coming to you live from Concordia University's fourth space, located in downtown Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, on unceded Indigenous land. Fourth space is the front door to the university, where we facilitate daily activities that allow for knowledge sharing by focusing on what Concordia community members are working on in terms of namely research, various initiatives, and course activities. We are joined today by three panelists, Tanya Tajmel, Nadia Naffi, and Ann-Louise Davidson, who will discuss new developments for the future of education and new approaches to designing course content, building connections, and designing learning experiences that prepare the students for the future of work and full participation in society. Let me just briefly introduce those three panelists. Dr. Ann-Louise Davidson is an associate professor of education. She holds the Concordia University Research Chair in Maker Culture. She is the director of Concordia University's Innovation Lab, very exciting. She is also associate director of the Milieu Institute for Arts, Culture, and Technology, and she directs Milieu Make, the Milieu Makerspace Initiative. Dr. Nadia Naffi is an associate professor of educational technology in the Department of Teaching and Learning Studies at the Faculty of Education and holder of the chair in educational leadership in innovative pedagogical practices in digital contexts, National Bank at Université Laval. She co-leads the Education and Empowerment Axis of the International Observatory on the Societal Impacts of AI and Digital Technology. Welcome, Ann-Louise. Welcome, Nadia. And finally, we have Dr. Tanya Tajmel, who is an associate professor with the Center for Engineering in Society and Concordia University Research Chair in Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics, so EDI in STEM for short. She established the EDI Lab, a platform for students and researchers to discuss EDI research in STEM fields. She is also leading Decolonizing Light, which is an interdisciplinary project exploring approaches to decolonial science. I'll just remind you very quickly that you're more than welcome to jump into the conversation by raising a hand if you're joining us here in Zoom, and we'll unmute you during a Q&A so that you might speak. The text apps are activated, so you can chat with us that way as well. And of course, we are live streaming and recording this event to YouTube and connecting with Montreal Connect right now, and the audience is joining us there. So welcome in, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. I'll just jump right in and start with possibly the most difficult question to get us started here. What do we mean by future of education? Is this something that we are preparing for? Is this future now? And Louise, I'm looking at you because when we first thought of this panel, we had an intense conversation about this topic. And I wonder if you could discuss what exactly is at stake here.
start by unmuting. Thank you, Anna. So when we refer to the future of education, we are most often discussing ideas that will help the past move forward. And, if we think back of the industrialization that brought the concept of schools divided by classes, which had rows of desks, divided by disciplines such as language, science, mathematics, social studies. History has shown that as society evolves, we need to create new disciplines. And for example, we had the emergence of media and computers where we saw the need to create media studies and educational informatics, for example. And if I think of a discipline-based conjecture, teachers obtain their credentials through becoming contact experts who know how to respect conventions and integrity of their disciplines, which is largely still the case today. And in higher education, if you look at how subjects are further divided into branching out disciplines that either involve studying theories, scientific methods, processes for developing knowledge and practice in these hyper-specialized fields. People study academic subjects related to the liberal arts, performing arts, business, and engineering. There are other possibilities such as vocational degrees that lead to trades, professional degrees that directly lead to professions such as journalism, law, medicine, dentistry, pharmacy. I can name a lot, optometry, podiatry, veterinary science, professional engineering degrees, and K-12 education. It might look like I'm stating the obvious here, but what's important to remember is that this has been the dominant current for over a century, and we have become convinced that this is the way to educate. On the contrary, it's only a format of education. We're not thinking that it's only a format. We're thinking that this is education, but it's a format that has its strengths and its flaws. And, in a conjecture where we're doing a lot of social reproduction, overvaluing of some forms of intelligence over others, inequality of chances, lack of diversity in the content, underrepresentation of minorities, lack of relevance in the content, isolation of learners through various forms of inclusion. We have become aware of this. We were aware of this a long time ago. When the COVID pandemic hit, the flaws that were plaguing the traditional modes of education became more evident. But all of this is tightly stitched together in the backdrop of systemic oppression, which calls for more attention to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I think that when we talk about the future of education, we talk about, well, what are the expectations of a good educational system that gives equal chances to everybody, and that actually allows people to not only get prepared for jobs, but also to be fully fledged contributing citizens that are responsible and attentive. So the future has expectations, and we must start making adjustments today. So that's what I think is the future of education.
Thank you. What a great way to open the session. And perhaps before we dive into the specifics of this conversation, maybe I'll ask Tanya and Nadia as well to broadly speak about the expectations of the future of education from their perspectives and what adjustments must we make. Over to you, Tanya.
Thank you, Anna, for this question, and thanks, Ann-Louise, for this great introduction, which very much resonates with me and my work, especially your thoughts about the disciplines and also the considerations of equity, diversity, and inclusion in education. I think I always approach the question of education from the human rights-based perspective. Education is a human right, and the future of education will build on the past and on what we learned about education, on the traditions of education, and also the failures and the strengths that we learned in the last years and in the last 100 years. So when we talk about education, I always like to think about the different facets of education. And there is, for example, one facet, which is the circumstances of education. We learned in the last 1.5 years the benefits of online education, right? So if the pandemic would have hit us 10 years earlier, we wouldn't have been able to deliver quality education, high quality education, as we did in the last 1.5 years. So this is definitely something that relates to education and technology. What role does technology play in education? And there is the question of teaching classes online or teaching classes in person. So this is not only a technological question, it's also a question about connections and building relations to students. I think we will discuss this point later also. But then there is also a question of education and institutions. And Ann-Louise, you already pointed that out. Education is institutionalized in the form of schools, which is on one hand very important and very good because it guarantees that the right to education is fulfilled. And on the other hand, of course, education is also a means to colonialism, for example. And we learned in the last months the terrible history of education in Canada. So we also have to consider and to include that in our considerations about education, that this does not happen again, not in any way, right? So we have to be aware of the politics of education, the institutional components of education, and we have to be very careful with that as well. And last but not least, education is also telling something about the world, right? We are educating worldviews. We are narrating the world in our education. And therefore, it is also an extremely important facet of education to think about what is the content, what is our narratives, what do we tell about the world in our education. So I think these are three major facets, three major topics of education that I like to consider and to think about further.
I'll jump in. So hi, everyone. Thank you, Anna, for your question, and Tanya and Ann-Louise for what you've just shared. I totally agree with you. So what I can add, I think that we all are witnessing that there are major global trends and threats that have already changed or likely to change our academic practices and guide this future of education that you started talking about. We saw how COVID forced us to transition to online courses and remote working, but this did not lead to a widespread of digital acceptability. We have been able to explore what was once considered impossible about teaching online, but we still have faculty members who now more than ever want to drop the technologies used during COVID and return to the old ways of teaching because their experiences were not successful. While we are in the midst of a digital and pedagogical transformation, and preparing the workforce and of the future requires personalization and diversification of the student experience and innovation in teaching practices. So we need to address digital acceptability so we can use digital technologies to assist in the whole EDI goal, because we see that the EDI culture is being considered for the entire student pathway from admission to integration into the labor market through course and program content and pedagogical and support practices. So we are expecting innovation in inclusive pedagogy. But you also discussed this last year or 18 months, the importance of wellness and mental health that are now considered inseparable from physical health. They are the subject of constant attention due to numerous reports of psychological distress experienced by students and professors. We also talked about the climate crisis and our role as universities and as educators, how now universities are directly called upon to develop solutions to counter this threat through education, research, and responsible behavior. And the impact on the university will not be limited to specific programs. It is expected that all practices will include an approach that takes into consideration or into account the climatic consequences. We also saw the whole changes with demographic and the resulting labor shortage, which has been anticipated for many years by various models, and they have a direct effect on the supply and demand of training. So there is a pressing demand for short, accelerated training courses to qualify and retrain workers. The notion of future skills is now widely used in universities to prepare students to meet major social challenges. So we've been discussing for, again, many months now, whether at Université Laval or I believe in all universities, the whole digital strategy that we need to adopt, whether by thinking about how we can transform ourselves as an institution through digital technology and ensure that our community has a richer experience, both virtually and physically, how to rethink the physical and virtual spaces and ensure pedagogical alignment between the two spaces, how to develop digital skills and digital agency of all our members, like the whole members of the community, from students to professors to staff working at our institution, how to empower learners to take ownership, not only of what they learn, how they learn, when they learn, where they learn. For instance, at Université Laval, we adopted the HighFlex model, and this is a model that I really advocate for because it gives flexibility in time and space and supports student-led learning with flexible approaches to participation, but also flexible learning paths. So learners or students can choose between modes of participations. They can choose the activities. All activities are they have all their equivalent activities, so they can reach their learning objectives. All the materials are reusable. And when we talk about accessibility, it doesn't only include access to internet and stable bandwidth and the technology, but also the whole idea about developing the skills, digital skills for learners to be able to participate in this digital world. So we talk about equity and participation in the digital world. So I think the future of education, we're moving from, with the whole thing that was happening with COVID, from emergency distance education to the inevitable long-term digital transformation of education institutions. And we need to achieve adaptive, personalized, equitable, and most importantly, more humane learning. So I think the future of education must be a humane education that puts human at the center of all its decisions.
Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, Tanya. Those were very rich responses. And before moving on to the question of emancipation, I wonder, Ann-Louise, if you had any feedback after hearing what both of your colleagues have said here, if you have anything to add before moving along.
Well, there's it's a mouthful, actually. There is a lot to say. And one of the things is very often that I ask myself is, like, if we're going to implement any change, and the system seems to be ready, are the people ready to change? And that means both policymakers, teachers, or anybody who qualifies himself as instructors, and learners as well. One of the things about, changing the roles and maybe changing the structures of oppression that were embedded inside our old traditional ways of doing things. And we were all victims in one way or another of that system. I remember being very happy to be the teacher's pet because I was very good at what I was doing. But when I became a teacher, I fought with that. I fought with figuring out what is it that I can do as a teacher to help those who are struggling, rather than just replicate the system that I have learned so well. And this is this question of the sociology of education, I think. We all spend a lot of time in schools, and we all have accepted in some way, shape, or form the structures of oppression and the issues that were part of that traditional system. So how do we train not only new teachers, but new instructors who don't have a training in education and pedagogy? How do we prepare students to see the difference also between voicing their opinion and literally opposing everything, right? So where is the equilibrium? And I think that as soon as we shake the system, there's a lot of things that are going to start happening. So there's a lot of identity crisis that I think is going to be part of that. And I think the question is, rather than disrupt the system entirely, how do we progress? What is our theory of progression? And I think we don't have a lot done there.
Thank you. Maybe we'll start digging in a little bit, jumping in a little further. So this event was titled communally here, Emancipatory Content, Connections and Experiences for the Future of Education. So if we start with the idea of emancipation and question that little bit, what does that mean really? And who do we need to emancipate, or emancipate from what? If I could pass it to you, Tanya.
Thank you. So I think what we already said is very much related to emancipation, right? What Nadia said about accessibility, which is also a fundamental part of the human right to education. This is very important. And also what we talked about, disciplinarity and crossing disciplinary boundaries. So empowering people to do that and to be able to do that. This is also something which can be related or can be understood as emancipation. I understand emancipation really as empowerment of individuals, empowering them to be able to participate actively in society, to participate in technological development, in innovation, to be educated, to have critique, to be able to critique development, and to be able to stand up and speak for their communities. And therefore, emancipation has to do something with power and with empowerment of individuals, but also of communities. We can also think of emancipation in a very, I would say, in a very materialistic way. When we think of the history of emancipation of women, emancipation was that women became independent, financially independent from their husbands in order to proceed their own careers, to do what was their choices to do, to find their place in the world, and not to be dependent on the finances and on the financial support of their husbands, and to have other perspectives than giving birth to children and being married as a woman. So this is also a very classical idea of emancipation, and I think emancipation, we should consider emancipation as being related to this kind of materiality as well. Emancipation has to do with a safety, a financial safety, but also a social safety, social security, which means we need, again, the structural and the institutional framework as well to have this emancipation. And at university or in higher education, emancipation also means to give students the opportunity to choose the research topics that are important for them. So I think this is what our institutional and our educational system should do. Who is defining the important topics? Who is defining the research that has to be done? And I think emancipating students means they are involved in this process and they have a voice in defining the research and in defining the topics of the future.
I'm so very glad that we're recording this conversation, because I feel like there's so many great ideas coming in. I need to have time to reflect on it all. Thank you, Tanya. Nadia, I wonder if you'd like to share your ideas.
Yeah, to follow after Tanya. So I think when I think about emancipation and when we're discussing the title, and it how can I say that? It generates like a feeling in my, you feel something that you need to set free from everything that is really what Ann-Louise was also mentioned, the traditional perception of what education is. So in my classes, when I talk with my students, when I talk with my colleagues, this is something that you feel that you are like tied, still imprisoned of how we imagine education and we imagine success, and what are the paths that are traditionally accepted and expected. So the whole idea about like how we access education, who facilitate education, how we measure learning, how we recognize skills and competencies. I think in academia we all need to become emancipated. I think students, professors, everybody, how we learn, how we teach, what is expected from us. We need to get liberated from the traditional evaluation system and approaches. And we saw that, especially in COVID, that, like evaluation was not working anymore because it was not designed to really evaluate. And what we were evaluating was not really what we were evaluating, but that was the traditional way of evaluating students' learning. Even evaluating, the whole course evaluation, evaluating professors, the whole process of, the tenure track that I'm going through right now. So you feel that we're imprisoned of some very traditional way of seeing the value of our performance and how we can grow and evolve and become fully fledged citizens and really participate in the whole societal, development. We're still tied to these old traditional way of doing things. So mostly for me, I think that we really need to emancipate students from, again, the traditional courses systems At Université Laval, we were talking about the whole idea of flexibilisation. So what means is that, we have these 3 credit courses with very specific times and very specific time, like meeting times and how much time they have to spend working, and they have to meet once per week, etc. So we're really looking at how we can remove these very specific ways of doing courses and really reinvent learning, reinvent our meetings with our students, reinvent what a learning experience should look like. We were thinking about hours, giving flexibility. So I'm just making sure that I'm not losing my notes, and when, how, where we're going to be learning, and equip our students to really become lifelong learners, seeking untraditional occasions for learning from untraditional ways and untraditional places. So let us liberate them from the walls of our classrooms and the traditional way of seeing that success only has one way, like we have only one path to success, and that there is no other ways except from going through these very specific courses and very specific way of learning. So, yeah, and I'm gonna stop here.
Maybe I'm gonna jump in. I could talk about this for such a long time because there is so much. Both in the argumentation and the theoretical and the history of what we are saying right now. I'm just going to start maybe with like revealing one source of issues where we need to emancipate ourselves, and like a little bit what Tanya was saying in terms of who decides the topics, and the same thing with Nadia, and like who decides on the structure of how we teach. One of the topics that I studied, or the research area that I studied when I was a young scholar, was empowerment and housing programs with people with intellectual disabilities. Let's just start with what we mean by intellectual disability. It has to be fitting what the DSM, so the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, actually says. This is how you diagnose it. What the actual person means, if you remove the idea of the label, is another thing. And not every person with an intellectual disability has the same autonomy problem. So I was working with people with light to moderate intellectual disabilities who were living with their parents and who wanted to live on their own. Most of the times, parents are very old. Sometimes we're talking about, let's say, a 44-year-old living with a 75-year-old parent, or an 80-year-old parent who's heading for a nursery home, and then the 44-year-old needs to go with her parent, live in a nursery home. That's they're telling me that's not normal, Ann-Louise. Like, why do I have to go live in an elderly home when I'm 44 years old? So I was working with this organization in Ottawa called Live, Work, Play, and we were trying to find ways in which we could get these people to live on their own, and I'm not going to say the word, interdependence. So the idea was, at first we said, okay, so we're going to go to Carleton University over the summer, and we're going to get them to live on their own in the student residence, and we'll study various aspects of autonomy, diet, use of technology, communication, getting around the city, and maybe even trying to find jobs that are paid and not just voluntary jobs. So I started studying this, and I found all sorts of collaborative action processes that were really interesting and very empowering, where people could actually find voice, start to tell me, here's the issue, can we work through this, can we find processes, support structures, here's a problem, let's talk about this. And when I started becoming a professor, I was really convinced that technology could be used for empowerment if used wisely, and I really want to continue this. So I tried to get this funded. The Social Sciences Council, Social Sciences and Humanities Council, SSHRC anyway, said if this is health related, it has to go to CIHR. Okay, health and well-being has to go to CIHR. So the next year, my grant was denied. It was seen as not eligible. The next year, I submit to CIHR, and there's a new interdisciplinary committee in CIHR. So I submitted to that committee, and then they say, well, this is not clinical research, so we cannot fund it. So I managed to get it funded through various sources of creative funding. And I also got the Petro-Canada Young Innovators Award in all sorts of ways in which the university supported me, and small pockets of money here and there where I could, basically pay students to do the work with me, because that's what we do in higher education. We train our students. And then I started realizing if I train people to do this, they will never get funded. ever. So it's great for pragmatic and meaningful research. But as soon as they want to become researchers and do PhDs, there is no way they're going to get this kind of research funded. Here's a form of problem where I think, we must emancipate ourselves, and we must find ways in which we can study things that are really fundamentally relevant, but fall through the cracks of those who decide what are the topics. Not just the topics of courses, but the topics of what we can actually fund. So on this, I can talk about a lot of things, Freirean pedagogy and the whole dichotomy between, when the oppressed want to reach the ranks of the oppressors, their role is not to oppress, but now to start liberating the oppressed and helping the oppressed participate in the pedagogy of their liberation. We can also talk about, pragmatic learning, or more, related to maker culture, where we abandon traditional forms of scripted assignments and more more hands-on assignments where it's more playful and more iterative, and we can abandon the script, explore the uncharted paths, allow ourselves to take risks and fail and reflect on what failed, not know, and allow ourselves to feel insecure about not knowing, and feel confident that we can still be successful if we don't follow the the scripted path to education. The whole idea also of feeling creative and lighting the flame rather than turning down the flame. As soon as we get to school, drawing is so fun when you're a kid. And then people tell you, that they don't go over the lines. And I'm like, I'm going to go over the lines and I'm going to make hairy shapes when I draw. I'm going to have fun with this. And then you go to school and then they show you how to draw properly. And then you stop having fun drawing because somebody tried to show how to do this properly. Who means proper, right? So this is what we mean by emancipating learners from traditional forms of knowledge, because we have made so many mistakes. When I was a kid, I made a mistake with, how many planets existed, and I forgot one of the planets, which is no longer a planet anymore. Who cares about the content? It changes. It's fluid. So, I think it's also about allowing the messiness, giving voice, and not reducing. Like those who speak are often those who have the self-esteem to speak, and those who often feel judged by some kind of like uncommon ideas or obscure ideas that they might have, or questions. We have to stop this, and we have to start saying, well, what if this was the proper way of doing things? So allowing students also to, I guess the last intervention is to publish for real rather than writing assignments for an audience of one, because this is what we do in our courses. Students write assignments for an audience of one, which is us. And if students could start publishing various forms of assignments, not just written, but also multimedia, and publish them for real rather than just for professor evaluation by the professor or the instructor, I think we would move forward in various forms of emancipation, especially in higher education. So I'll stop here.
Can I jump in and ask Ann-Louise a question that was not planned? Ann-Louise, while you were talking about the whole maker culture thing, before I leave Concordia and go to L'Université Laval, I spent a lot of time in your makerspace. And there was many examples of students who were emancipated through the experience and I witnessed one very specific, particular, who went in with very low confidence, and she was really, she didn't have any, she was, how can I say that, submerged with all her ideas about how there's no value in whatever she was doing. And then she transformed can you talk about, give example? Because I think that, our audience would be very interested in some examples of how the change that happened in your makerspace.
I don't know which example you're talking about, because I have a lot of those narratives. And I think I need to write a little storybook with those empowerment narratives at one point, because there's so many stories, especially of girls, or those who identify as girls, who came through the makerspace. And what they learned there was so much more than just programming Arduino and 3D printing and doing like pragmatic stuff. It's like a building of identity. One example is a student who wasn't able to be admitted to engineering because of, I think the Code R du Québec was problematic. And she tried several times. She was very discouraged. She took other courses in other fields, and she kept on telling me, one day I will be an engineer. Maybe people are convinced that I will not be an engineer, but in my mind, I will be an engineer one day. So she came in the makerspace, and she was a first-year student. And I said, well, okay, I have a small pocket of money to animate the makerspace. How about I give this to you? Your job is to prepare an event at the end of the year. So we have, I usually host Arduino Day, and it's kind of like a really exciting event. Usually happens in the month of March or April, Arduino or International Day. And Arduino Day needs some kind of organization. There's a pitch that you need to make to arduino.cc, and then there's like a media kit, and then you have to organize the event. But I said, to organize this event, you have to have some form of credibility. So you have to be able to program something, or to do a project, or to give a workshop, or whatever it is. So as she hosted some events, took care of the makerspace, I didn't give her any structure. I just gave her the objective. I'd like you to host an event, whatever that event might look like. Here's what we did last year. Here's what other people do, and just go for it. So in September, she started coming to the regular Maker Jam, hosting events, starting to understand like how people, what do people do in these Maker Jams, and then going to the makerspace to study, but at the same time trying things out. And then she couldn't program, so she created a little network around herself, and then people started coming and help her program in Arduino. And then she made a portal gun, Rick and Morty portal gun, a replica of this with her name. But it was kind of funny because tongue in cheek, when she managed to get it working, it was just close to the event. And then she got admitted to an engineering degree in another university, which, was a success for her. And what we all said, you really transported yourself with that portal gun to another dimension. That's pretty cool. What's really interesting is that I kept in touch with her. And when she was talking about, her entry into engineering and what she did, she started working in another makerspace. And there she said the challenges was really not the same. My time was more as a technician, and she saw a completely different program than what I was doing with the education makers, which is much more ad lib. Let's make activities. Let's do stuff that's fun. And there was no real, I was not counting time. I said, you have 4 or 5 hours a week, whatever. Tell me how you're progressing. Tell me what's happening. Tell me what I can do to help you. And just go with it. I can't tell you that this works all the time. Sometimes people just crash and they just end up not spending the time. But in these particular cases, when it does work, it's extremely empowering for the student. Fast forward 2 years after, she tells me that she was interviewed and she got the internship in engineering because the people who were interviewing her got so excited that she worked in a makerspace. They wanted to know what she learned. So the formation of identity, the fact that you have something to talk about, the portfolio that you build, you're able to create events, you're able to create your own projects, you've learned the fundamentals of programming with the Arduino IDE, a lot of other things also that happens, the networking, and all of a sudden you have a person that basically flourished in this environment where before, everybody was saying, oh, she doesn't have an opinion, she doesn't have the skill, and so on and so forth. So if you give people opportunities to emancipate themselves from what they are, and they have the will, and you give them the structure rather than the orders, right? I could have said, every week you have to, here's a checklist of tasks, and you have to check what you've done, and then please submit a report to me by the end of the week. And I could have checked the person. I can go to the makerspace and check, are you doing the work? But doing that is not what happens in professional fields. You're pretty much on your own, and you have milestones, you have objectives, you have to perform. And if somebody has to watch you all the time, then that means that you have, a second grade job. But if you want to become a leader, you want to become more empowered with your career, you have to be able to self-regulate, to get some feedback, to build your network, to identify milestones. And this is basically a small emulation of what was happening that year in the makerspace. So I think it can be successful, but it's also risky because I would say it's 50-50, 50% failure and 50% success.
I also jump into that. What Nadia said, and also Ann-Louise, I think what I hear out of that is that a multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary approach is so important and can empower so much, because this is all very interdisciplinary. And it's basically really ridiculous because all the major global problems are interdisciplinary problems, right? Climate change or whatever. So these are interdisciplinary problems, and we are still stuck in these disciplinary boundaries. And I experienced so many students and their personal growing when they were able or when they were allowed to draw on their interdisciplinary competencies. So I think this is really important. And thank you, Ann-Louise, for this great story. This is very encouraging.
Thanks, and I'm seeing some great comments coming into the chat as well that further this conversation. But I wonder, Tanya, if maybe we could spotlight over to you for a second to hear more about the major initiative called Decolonizing Light that you're working on, to explore kind of new ways and approaches to decolonize science. And we're bringing this up to further this conversation with regards to content and reform, and how content actually moves from a traditional kind of pathway to new forms of creation. And I think you've all spoken to that quite a bit already. But I wonder, Tanya, if you'd like to tell us about this specific project or any other kind of initiative that you've undertaken to discuss kind of what is at stake here in terms of looking at the past as well, and maybe correcting some of the mistakes from the past.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Anna. So the Decolonizing Light project is a project that I'm leading together with Dr. Llewellyn White, from Associate Professor at First People Studies, and Dr. Ingo Salzman from the Departments of Physics and Chemistry and Biochemistry. And we started this project in 2019. The project is funded, I like to mention that because it is funded by public means. So I think that's also always important how projects are supported. It is funded by the NFRF fund, which is New Frontiers in Research Fund, which is a pretty new initiative of the Canadian Research Council, the tri-agency councils. Just for the non-professors audience, so there are 3 councils that are funding research. One part of research is more social science oriented, social sciences and humanities. That is what Ann-Louise mentioned with the SHRC as this HRC. The other one is the health related funding agency, and the third one is natural sciences and engineering related research. And there was this new call, and is still this new initiative of interdisciplinary funding. So that's actually a great opportunity to apply for when you have interdisciplinary projects. And our project was luckily selected and is now funded by the NFRF. What we are trying to do is we are trying to find approaches to decolonize science from different perspectives. Therefore, we have this very interdisciplinary scientific board consisting of members from First People Studies, Indigenous astronomy, but also members from sociology, from natural sciences, from engineering. So this is a very broad perspective. And we are focusing on light and not, for example, on science or on optics. We could also say decolonizing optics, right? But optics is already a term which is connected to science. So it's basically the science of light is optics. And we wanted to find something where we are not excluding non-scientists. And by addressing or by focusing on light, we found a content and a topic which resonates with everybody, because everybody has experience with light. Everybody knows light. This is maybe also related to Freiren's pedagogy, or Ann-Louise, I would love to discuss that with you, because it is an everyday content, right? But when you look up light in Wikipedia or in Google, you only find the scientific explanation about light, the quantums and the wavelengths and so on. I don't say that this isn't important, and this is the scientific explanation, but it looks like light is completely contextualized only with high physics, right, with science. And we ignore that there are other experiences with light and other, let's say, importance of light in different aspects. So therefore, we are collaborating also with Indigenous scholars and with Indigenous communities. And our 4 approaches, so there are different approaches that we are trying to find to the big question of how to decolonize a specific content. And one approach is, for example, to look at teaching content. What are we actually teaching about light, and how is this contextualized? And we found in the science textbooks, one of the sub-projects is to investigate science textbooks and how they are presenting scientific content. And we found that the scientific content is presented in a very Eurocentric way. All famous scientists or all people who have something to say and to contribute to knowledge are from or were from European origin. Interestingly, this changed a little bit. The people who are mentioned now as the present people who are contributing to scientific content are from Canada and the US. So we see here a lot of reinforcement of, let's say, colonial power relations, settler colonialism, and this is a work in process, so we are still working on that. That's very interesting. The other approach that we have chosen is to connect with indigenous knowledge keepers to know more about their rich knowledge about light. So, for example, we built relations and connected to Wilfred Buck, who is indigenous astronomer, and Llewellyn White organized a workshop, a course in the framework of her First People Studies course, where she invited Wilfred Buck, and he shared his knowledge about indigenous astronomy, and students were extremely impressed about that. And here we also saw how much it could empower students when they hear knowledges from different knowledges, diverse knowledges, different cultural backgrounds. So this is also something that we are continuing to work on, to decolonize astronomy and to see and to identify that there is much more in astronomy that we could learn than that students are learning right now. Another project has to do with empowerment and empowerment of communities. In this project, we are collaborating with the KIPO, the Kanawake Environment Protection Office in Kanawake, and we conceptualized together with them, and here I have to mention Dr. Gregor Kos from the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry, because he is leading this sub-project. We conceptualized an air quality project, a citizen science air quality project, and the first workshop took place in last August, very successfully, where citizens of Kanawake were trained to build their own air quality measurement devices. Citizens who were not scientists and not science students, but they are building their own measurement devices. They put them, they place them in front of their house, in their garden, and they collect data, their data. The data belongs to them, and this empowers them to make arguments and to contribute to the discourse about environment. Right, so this is something that has to do with empowerment and how science education can contribute to empowerment. Why is this connected to light? Because these devices work with laser, and laser light is used to measure and to identify the pollution in the air. What else? Another example that we discovered in our scientific textbook analysis is the content and how colonial content is represented in textbooks. We are also analyzing Brazilian textbooks because Brazil also has a history of colonialism. There are many similarities with Canada, and it also promotes STEM education as a very important part of education in order to tap human resources for economic growth. So there is a very similar narrative to that. And what we found is that they are teaching and talking about the Newton's gravitational force. You all know maybe the example that the apple falls from the tree, right? So that is because of the gravitational force. And this example is a very European example. And you find this apple that is falling from the tree also in the Brazilian textbook, but in Brazil there are no apple trees. So you see that the content is a completely European or North American content, I would say. Or in Argentina, there are also apple trees, but in Brazil, there are coconut trees and mango trees and avocados, but you do not have apple trees, but they didn't adapt the content. So it's still this very Eurocentristic framework, and also reflected in the content that is being taught. So yeah, this project is very interesting because there are so many different ways and different approaches that we found could contribute to decolonizing science. We are also collaborating with Donna Goodleaf, Indigenous director for Decolonizing curriculum. And this is a great, I would say, a great team that we are working together. We are very challenged because we always have to reflect our own disciplines and our values, what we were taught in our own studies, and what is real academic work. So this is really something that's great, and it's also great to build these relations and to have these connections.
Thank you, Tanya. And I'll just note that we are so thrilled that all three of you were able to join this conversation as kind of models of inspiration, if I may, or leaders in these sorts of field of pushing boundaries and thinking through various kind of alternative ways of knowing and challenging traditional training practices and approaches. And thank you for sharing those projects with us, Tanya. Maybe I'll put some links in the chat for people to find out more about the Decolonizing Light project as well. But Nadia, how about you? Can you discuss, I know you're leading many initiatives, and perhaps if you'd like to speak to one or two of them and discuss how these initiatives are challenging traditional training approaches and the work that you do.
First of all, I want to say, Tanya, your examples of projects, that they are really amazing. Like seriously, it's very, very inspiring. Regarding lifelong learning and all this, the innovative pedagogical practices, I had the pleasure of having Mr. Schleicher from the Director of Education from OECD as panelist on one of the panels I organized on lifelong learning. And he invited us to start treating learning not as a place, but as an activity. That we needed to think of the modern place of work that is always a place for learning, that technology has made learning ubiquitous, that we learn now from coworkers, we need to stay up to date. So really remove learning from the walls that it was tied to, and really think about learning as a continuous activity. He shared that we used to learn to work, but now we're learning is the work. So the culture of lifelong learning has become a priority, especially for the post-COVID recovery. There is indeed a serious need for innovative and even disruptive approaches to training to help people to continue to grow. And these approaches include responsive, adaptive, flexible, personalized, mobile, self-directed, collaborative training, self-study, on-demand training, experiential challenge, peer learning. Some training must be available when learners or employees need it, such as just-in-time training or learning in the flow of work. And various trainings are using emerging technologies such as augmented, virtual, or mixed or cross reality, to name a few. We also look at artificial intelligence and how it's being applied to predict, to assess for adaptive systems, as well for personalization of learning and learning systems. And we also look at the intelligent tutorial systems. We also look at how blockchain and other disruptive technologies used for lifelong learning and global learning pathways. We are talking about pedagogical approaches and modalities through which the learner is active and in control of their experience and their learning environment. So the digital transformation expands and diversifies education, training, and learning opportunities. And one of the things so there is the chair that I hold in education leadership in innovative digital practices that is funded by the National Bank at Université Laval, that holds I'm leading several projects to explore the use of this technology in a critical, ethical, responsible, and sustainable way, to make sure that how we're using these different technologies and how we're creating learning experiences, it's really not the use of technology because it's trending, but the use of technology to answer the needs of our learners. And we're making sure that we're really focusing on how to create these equitable learning experiences for these learners from different contexts and with different needs and different characteristics. We also see that there's a very important, I'm also doing this through the the access, education and capacity and empowerment, education and capacitation in OVIA. So we're really looking at the impact of these technologies, the societal impact of these technologies. Why we're doing this? Because the needs of our society and our workers and our learners now, they are evolving, and we need to make sure that we're answering to these needs, especially that we're in an era where learners are not limited to, or now they're considering other than the degrees, the traditional degrees that they're getting from universities. They are exploring other ways, other pathways. I don't know, maybe a couple of weeks ago, LinkedIn launched its LinkedIn Learning courses, and what they have on their website, the phrase or the slogan that they have is learn in demand skills with over 16,000 online courses taught by real-world professionals. So this idea of having, really instead of having degrees on all these different, topics, or it's really focusing on in-demand skills, so fast learning, and it's done by professionals, so people who are coming from the fields. Many companies are creating their own certification systems too. So while in many professions we are still, and we need to get a degree from academic institution to do the job, there are growing jobs that do not need degrees, and many are considering the paths that they can get these certification and integrate, that help them integrate very quickly in the job market. And even, when you look at the evolution of the gig economy. So to answer the needs of the future and current workers, we need to rethink our offers of training, what we are offering, the flexibility of our offerings, the value of our offerings, what sets us apart from all these big companies and what they are offering. We need to be part of the lifelong learning ecosystem. We need to work with employers and with sectors in particular, in particular to put them at the center of our work and skills and education. And one of the things, and I'm gonna end with that, is that in the program that I teach in, the education technology program at Université Laval, one of the things that we're doing is really preparing instructional designers and the education technologists to answer to these needs and create these different experiences for learners based on all these needs and evolving needs, and help them become more agile and more adaptable to adaptative, adaptability, develop their adaptability to what's happening and all the different technologies that are emerging, and see how they can actually use them in a very critical and ethical way to help workers today and tomorrow's workers. And I'm going to stop here because I can talk about the program forever.
No, that's great, Nadia. And it sounds like what you're really calling for is a sort of reform. And maybe I'll segue to Ann-Louise here, who has been involved in the school reform in Ontario for over a decade and has been leading maker education initiatives for over 5 years. And Louise, why would you say it's so difficult to reform curriculum, and what does it take to kind of materialize new approaches from theory to practice? What would you say?
It's $1 million question, but I can start with the idea of like how do curriculum review exercises happen? It's usually the same voices that go back and just revise and lean out some aspects and beef up some other aspects. And to me, the real problem is the multiple voices that are not represented in those curriculum review exercises. It's also the question of, the growth of scientific knowledge. And I mentioned that a bit earlier on in terms of, what are the pockets that are actually paying for research, because scientific knowledge grows in a certain way that has a scientific logic, but there are other ways to help knowledge grow. And there are other ways of, even identifying what is knowledge in itself. There's also, a lack of credibility in knowledge co-construction, and an over-credibility in authoritarian voices. Like, who said this? Who published this? Which journal publishes this? And in terms of, who gets, and it touches a little bit what Tanya was saying in terms of, the textbooks. Who gets to write those textbooks? It's, part of it is historical, the other part is commercial. And to really reform curriculum requires questioning each aspect of this. Is the time of the class convenient? Does it make sense to have classes over a year or over 4 months? Or what is the structure? When do people meet? And that touches what Nadia was saying in terms of learning as an activity rather than a place. Because to go to courses, to wait for professors to give you information, and then to either memorize that information or to do something to manipulate that information to feed it back to the professor in a way that emulates what the professor wants, is not learning. It's basically playing the game of education. In French, I would say, exercer son bon métier d'élève. So you are exercising your good, practices as a learner. And if you really want to reform education, we have to look at everything, including standards of profession and semantics. Because one of the things that happens is that, okay, for example, and I don't want to pronounce myself over decolonizing curriculum, but I can go back to just, the change when we said, okay, we have to go from objectives to competencies. People were saying, okay, no, now stop saying objective. Now you have to say competency, because now we build competencies. But they never changed anything in practice. What does it mean to even say you're going to develop a competency as opposed to you're going to develop a skill? What does it mean to even say I'm going to evaluate competencies as opposed to evaluating knowledge on a test? That questioning has not even happened. And the idea of reform very often people are saying, okay, so I'm going to say the right political word because this is what we're saying, but it never translates into action. So if you look, for example, at school reforms, and I'm not going to talk about university curriculum reforms because that's even more complex, but school reforms are political. And if you look at what happened since 2001 in Quebec and in Ontario, 2 reforms happened, about the same time. In the 1990s, we started saying there's a problem. 1995, there was a change of government in Ontario, and they said, well, let's reform education. And at the time, I was doing teacher education. And I remember we said, everything we're learning now is going to be invalid when we start working. And I opened both documents and I started looking. And to me, they were so closely related. And I don't even think that the government thought through what the words of the researchers who consulted on the modes or the system or the approaches to the new educational reform actually meant. So it became sort of like a mishmash of old stuff that was pasted in. And then there were competencies that were identified, but then there were expectations as well. And then we have to evaluate with a rubric. And then there's no training, there's no preparation. Nobody really understands, like, why do we have to do a reform? It's because the government says we have to do a reform. But the real foundations of the reform, like, what is the reason? Because now we don't have any more special education classes. They're going to be integrated. What does that mean? Oh, that means I have to teach the weak students? Yeah, that's your job, actually. But when you teach to the gifted students and they all have A's and you tap yourself in the back because you're so good, they actually don't need you. They will learn regardless. So it was an invitation to start really being pedagogues. And people, let's go back to what I was saying before. People have to be willing to change. They have to be willing to change their roles, their approaches, and it goes from policy to individual action that never really happens. So there are multiple tensions here, and I could talk about it for a long time, but that's basically the gist of this.
Maybe we'll just, thank you, Ann-Louise. I'm thinking about what you just, where you just mentioned students and how students might work with one another or how they might connect to their professors, and thinking through making connections and making real connections and what that actually looks like to develop one's network. It does require opportunities to build a skill set, of course, and it doesn't necessarily just suffice to tell students to reach out to their networks. And if we think back to the early days of online learning, students did mention feeling isolated and lonely in their courses. This is something very real that we've been talking about over the last little while, which feels like a very long while. With the evolution of the social web and all the platforms that exist, we would think that connections can be done somehow organically. The truth is, of course, that students don't need just any connections. They need relevant connections with peers and community organizations and even potential employers. And I wonder what we can do about this in higher education. So I'm looking at you, Nadia, first, because you're very visible on social media, and so are your students. We have seen you on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok. Can you explain how these social networks can be leveraged to build meaningful connections for students in your experience, and how one can use such networks to create their brand or curate their presence on and offline?
Thank you, Anna, for this question. Yeah, I've been on social media for a while now, and I'm a strong advocate of being on social media in a very critical, responsible way. So I teach courses at the graduate level, and I also supervise PhD students. And in all courses, my students know that I expect them to be on social media, to start exploring, filtering content, and again, in a very critical way, to build their online presence, to build their network, to learn individually and with other, to develop their digital competencies. That not only that, it's really about developing their online agency, to be part of the conversations that are happening online, to have a voice, to argue, and again, to learn with others. I'm gonna give you some examples of what I do with my students, just to illustrate how this is happening, because like I introduce social media in all my classes. Like in all my courses, students have some work to be done on social media, and we transition throughout the semester we start with some resistance and some fear about social media, and we discuss really critically how and why we should be on social media. And again, it's not about simply because we should, it's like, what are the benefits and what are the things that we need to be aware of and really be critical about when we are on social media. So one of the assignments that I give my students is what I call state of play, or so it's an assignment that consists of two parts. The first part requires interactions and exchanges on Twitter, and the second part requires a synthesis of knowledge from these exchanges. The students identify accounts and hashtags that they share resources around the context of their project in order to build an overview of the different elements, systemic factors, and realities that could influence learners' performance in these contexts. The goal of this exercise is really to develop a strategy for seeking open access information when access is limited. Several skills are developed through this work, especially strategic research, critical evaluation of content, effective filtration, and taking all this information that we find on Twitter. And Twitter is very fast, and it's really being very concise and being able to catch these different accounts that could be valuable, because you might find things that are worthless, but you also have a gold mine where you can actually be up to date of what's happening. So take all this information and being able to create or come with a synthesis of this information to be able to use it in your project. So really taking all this cow and making sense of it, and really deciding on where and with whom you want to connect. One of the other things on Twitter that I do is that I connect my students with my network. So the discussion that happens on Twitter is not only between students with the hashtag, but also my network start connecting with these students and really answering and, asking to their tweets or commenting on their tweets or sharing stuff, sharing resources regarding the topics that they're discussing. So it becomes really the whole collaboration on social media. So I give access to my students beyond my classroom, beyond even the small group who could be available to come and visit my class and give an hour of their time. these are interactions that are asynchronous. So whenever these, people who are experts in their field have some time to come and contribute to the discussion, they are welcome, and they really enrich our discussion. So we come back with things that in many cases, there are some stuff that are in the education technology field that I'm not aware of. And my students, based on these interactions that they have on Twitter, they come to the class with all this information. Another example is the Stay Current that I also do on LinkedIn. And LinkedIn is different from Twitter. So Twitter is fast. LinkedIn, you have to be engaged in groups, and really you have another dynamic that's happening on LinkedIn. So again, students go and engage in group discussions and bring to our LinkedIn group that is open and public, and everyone can join the group. So they bring in really elements and resources that could be very interesting to our discussions. And we also invite people from outside our classroom and outside of the network that we have, really people who are simply experts in the field and practitioners who can come and participate in these discussions. So the whole idea is really to enrich our discussions with all the whatever is existing online. So it's really opening the world to the students. Once they have these synthesis, whether this is from Twitter or based on whatever they shared on LinkedIn, I have a blog on the site of the chair that I hold, and this blog includes the articles that my students write. So it's really an optional thing. So I tell my students, this is a platform that you can use if you want to really share whatever you are writing. So what happens is that now with this blog, if you choose #student blog, you can see the blog of students. And what I do is that I share these writings that are written in an op-ed style. So really a concise 800, 1,000 words without jargon, with all the links, with my network. And we're, through this, people in the field are really seeing the expertise of my students and the skills of the students. And it's really, how can I say that, exposing them to all these different people. And what's interesting is that once I share, many of the education technology world contact students to, whether for projects or stuff like that. So it's really putting the students in the world and showcasing their skills and knowledge. I also share their e-portfolios. So the problem is that I still have some colleagues and students who consider, for example, Twitter only for journalists, Facebook only for narcissistic people who want to share what they eat, TikTok only for teenagers who want to dance. But there are so many possibilities with social media that I feel, okay, and this is really based on the many years that I've been on social media, that it would be really limiting my students' experience if I don't expose them and help them develop these skills to be safe online, but also to be able to benefit of what this opening and these technology could present to us as different platforms, etc. So I'm gonna stop here. Ann-Louise, you want to talk about social media too?
Well, I can actually jump in and just maybe swerve the discussion around social media through a different direction. In 2021, I launched the Concordia University Innovation Lab partly as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic shutdown. And I've been claiming that the Innovation Lab is a playground for students where they can come and work in interdisciplinary teams, build innovation skills, and work with mentors, industry, community partners, on innovation challenges. And the whole lab is done entirely online. So I should call it the On Lab. That's a nice lapsus. So what happens in the Innovation Lab is that there is no way I could actually do the Innovation Lab without some form of alternative technology. And I'll explain why. In the university, at Concordia University, we use Moodle for courses. And Moodle acts as a learning management system and a content management system. So you can put folders that are shared. People have to log in with their net name and their password, and then it's all protected. And we claim we do this because we need to protect the students. And I understand that completely. That's fair enough. I'm not going to challenge that. But if you want students to work with partners, you can't let partners enter Moodle unless they work for the university or they are a student at the university. You can do that with teams, but not everybody works with teams. So what we started doing is that, we were doing the presentation. We're doing all of the meetings on Zoom. That allows us to invite external partners, even people who don't have a setup with teams. Most people do, but that's sort of like how do we include as many people as possible in the conversation? And then we use Notion, which is a free software, free online software that allows us to put the content and allow the students to create little teams where they can actually create their productions there, knowing that you need to have an invitation to the online platform, but you don't lose access to the online platform after you finish your iteration of the innovation lab. So partners can be there, students can be there, and also previous students can be there. And then we've been needing a place to communicate. So of course, students will self-organize and they'll figure out, texting and, Messenger and what else. They'll choose their own platforms. But for me to be able to communicate with the students and communicate with so many partners, given the fact that I have in my mailbox, email, I have a sea of email every day. Sometimes it comes in at 200 per day. If I don't pay attention to my mail, I sink in it. And then people are asking me real relevant questions, but I can't answer. So we adopted Discord as a mode of interacting. Of course, Discord poses other problems, like you can have some invaders, you can have all sorts of things, but we found a way to control Discord to give a safe space for students where they can also invite partners, and they're not limited to the student account on Zoom, which is, I believe, after 40 or 50 minutes, it closes down. I forget exactly the amount of minutes, but with Discord, they can use the text channels, the audio channels, the video channels, and then they can put their content, they can interact, and we can invite partners and mentors as well without asking to create an institutional account for them. So there's also a lot of tweeting so that we can invite partners. There's also a lot of LinkedIn investment so that more partners can see what's happening, and a lot of people are reaching out to us. And that actually allowed us to connect with the whole network of les cercles d'innovation du Québec and everybody who's innovating that's very active on Twitter and on LinkedIn. Not as much on Facebook, but those are the platforms where innovators go. So we sort of swerve to the platforms where things are actually happening so that we can attract more people in to offer more expertise. And when I think of the notion of expertise, I did write a piece at one point on LinkedIn, which is, what is an expert? And the example I often give is the St. Lawrence captains. You can take your boat. A captain can take his boat or her boat from Europe and travel the ocean. And as they enter the St. Lawrence, they have to hand over the commands of the boat to a St. Lawrence captain who's an expert of navigating in the St. Lawrence. So we're all experts of different things. We can't be experts of everything. We have to acknowledge what the limits of our sciences at one point, and invite more voices. And the social media, to me, allows an invitation of more voices that I can curate. Of course, I test people out. I don't invite just anybody. Like, oh yeah, come on over. We're having a party. I make sure that I connect with these people, that I know who they are, that my relationship to the students is very positive as well. So if there's something that happens with a mentor, a partner, or somebody that came in and they need to voice something, that I don't have to wait until the end, or they don't have to feel as though this is my imposition. It's just connections. It's new people. Expand your network. See what you can do with this, and then it requires the expanding, and then after that, curating the network, and then repurposing that network so we can move forward. So that also touches what you said about filtering, Nadia. It's like, it's not just enough to filter. You also have to filter, aggregate, and then after that, connect, which is what Harold George was talking about in his online posts on LinkedIn. I'll stop here because
Thanks, Ann-Louise. Yeah, I was just looking at the time and noticing that we have just under 15 minutes left, and I wanted to make sure that we also have a chance to speak to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And thank you for sharing what's been happening with the Innovation Lab. That's super exciting. And Nadia, very inspiring, the work that you're doing with your students as well, using social media. But I wonder, Tanya, if we could turn it over to you for a few minutes to hear about the work, the graduate course that you're teaching on equity, diversity and inclusion in engineering. You also direct the EDI lab, and I'm just wondering if you could speak to the kind of skills that your students are developing to become better, more responsible citizens in STEM.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Anna, for the question. So actually, what we are dealing with in the EDI lab is exactly what Nadia and Ann-Louise were talking now. Basically, how does technology transform lives, and how does technology transform teaching as well? And what we as EDI lab would look at is, how is the technology transforming it in a way that it is reproducing social power relations? So how would this be connected to exclusion or inclusion mechanisms? And the EDI lab, well, that's a lab that I founded and established in the framework of my CURC, of my Concordia University Research Chair. And we are discussing questions of equity, diversity, inclusion that go beyond the policies, the equity policies, that also go beyond just, let's say, looking at different skin colors, but also to think about how equity is related to research and to research outcomes. So one very important question is, who is benefiting from a specific research? If it could be engineering, could be natural sciences, whatever, who is benefiting from a specific research? So, for example, we are looking very closely at artificial intelligence and how artificial intelligence is related to social equity, not only in the documented biases that it is reproducing and reinforcing, but also in the sense of how is the industry that is related to artificial intelligence contributing to equity. And for example, we found that the socioeconomic divide is basically not closing with artificial intelligence, not yet. So for example, there are more or there are less indigenous peoples employed in the artificial intelligence industry than in other industries. So that is also a very important aspect of equity, diversity, inclusion with regard to artificial intelligence. Another aspect is the energy that artificial intelligence needs. That is what I'm teaching in my EDI course, and in a newly developed course that I'm going to teach in the winter semester. For artificial intelligence, we need a lot of energy, and we need a lot of batteries, and these batteries need lithium and cobalt. And cobalt and lithium mining is a very problematic thing, which entails child labor and so on. So these are also ethical questions and questions of social equity that we are addressing in the course. I wanted to also comment on what Nadia and what Ann-Louise said by transforming and how technologies can help to improve connections and to enable connections with many people. I think it is also important to think about it as from a structural perspective, which means instructors are doing their teaching work. They love to teach, but we all know as instructors that the quality of teaching depends tremendously on the number of students that we are teaching. So for example, it seems easy to have an online course with 120 students, right? 120 students in an online course. It doesn't seem to be an issue at all, but you also have to consider the emails and the conversations that are going on. So, and instructors love and want to individualize their teaching and want to connect with their students and want to be very, very much linked to their students and to mentor them. But if we make a quick calculation, you have 180 minutes. One lesson lasts for 180 minutes, maybe 30 minutes you give a lecture. The rest, the 120 minutes are discussions. Now you have 120 students in your class, which means for each student you have 1 minute of individual exchange. And you have 13 weeks in the semester, which is 13 minutes per student. Now imagine we are now talking about 1.5 hours now. So we need time to exchange. We need time to build relations. We need time to connect. And I think this is something that we should be very careful about, that we should not be, let's say, swept away by the success of online classes and networks, because it requires from instructors a lot of time, especially young instructors, assistant professors, LTAs. All these instructors are really feeling the burden of, let's say, answering the emails that Ann-Louise mentioned. So I think this is also something that we have to keep in mind. I think we need more instructors in order to deliver a high quality education and to individualize the teaching. So this should still be one of our major interests, to say, okay, we need instructors. And many instructors, smaller classes means a good mental health, means the well-being of instructors, and instructors who are doing well are also better instructors. So yeah, about the EDI lab, if there are any further questions, I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, I think maybe we have questions from the audience as well. So I stop.
I don't know, Anna, if there are questions from the audience. I read a lot of comments and I appreciated every single of them. And I can continue talking a little bit about EDI, or maybe Nadia, you have a couple of things to say, because I know you're, you know, one of the objectives of your chair, Nadia, is to design inclusive and equitable learning experiences that will equip future educational technology experts to thrive in the digital and AI era, and meet the training needs of the future of work. So you also wrote a paper following the COVID-19 disruption, and you wrote an op-ed where you list 8 ways to improve equity and access in universities. And I wonder if you can tell more about this. Tell us more about this.
Yeah, very quickly. When we conducted our project during the summer 2020, and we were looking at equity in online learning, especially when we had this very fast transition, we adapted the working definition of equity in higher education by Brian Beatty, who is a professor of instructional technologies in the Department of Equity, Leadership Studies, and Instructional Technologies at San Francisco State University, and he's the pioneer of the high flex model. And in his definition, there are 3 points that we were focusing on. So students who are able to achieve equal learning outcomes as they are supported by institution, faculty, and other systems to engage in the learning process. All students are able to receive the financial, social, and academic support and guidance they need to succeed in the institutional program, thus enabling lifelong success as well. And all students are given access to appropriate and effective learning opportunities and instructional resources, activities, interactions, and evaluative assessment, which are differentiated according to their unique sets of characteristics and needs. So very rapidly, the 8 guidelines that emerged from the project that we conducted with 19 teaching and learning centers from different countries. We talked about first, create accessible materials, of course, to ensure that all documents are easily accessed by and shared by the students. With we have to provide description, hyperlinks, and images for students with, for example, visual impairments and using screen readers. So really working on the sharing, the accessibility of the material, choosing adequate digital technologies that are, again, accessible to all. I think this is a practice that everyone now is doing, recording our lectures and also captioning videos and audio content, adopting inclusive, culturally responsive teaching, adopting a flexible approach to student participation, ensuring financial support and equipment, understanding student needs, to really making sure that we're hearing them. We're hosting panels where they can actually discuss and share and let us hear what we need to know about what's happening with them. And lastly, address systemic racism, because despite the fact that many centers were talking about all the different activities and really the initiative that they are doing to support faculty in providing quality learning experiences and providing safe, equitable experiences for racialized students, there is more work to be done.
Thank you, Nadia. So I think we're approaching the end. A couple of minutes are left. I don't think there were questions from the audience, Anna, or did we miss anything? Okay. So I guess when we finish a forum like this, we have to ask ourselves, like, what are the next steps? And for me personally, one of the next steps is to work on affordances of spaces. When somebody walks into an innovation lab or a maker space, I don't want them to see the space as being exclusive to an elite. They're not just spaces to sit. There have to be places where people feel as though they can do something there. No matter who they are, they can join the conversation. And no matter how experienced they are, if they come from the STEM sciences or not, if maybe they were in STEM and they just felt as though this was not for them and they went into arts and science or humanities. So that, if you're going to progress as a society, it needs to be an interdisciplinary dialogue. And there's no way that we can do this just with one science. It has to be a group of people with multiple perspectives talking, multiple experiences, multiple perspectives talking. So I'd like to create more opportunities for that in the coming year. Is there any closing word that Tanya, you might have, or Nadia, you might have?
Go ahead, Tanya.
I'm not sure if it's a closing word, but it's just about, I think it would be important to make people aware of human rights and to get so that they know their rights. I think that is what I'm working on and what I'm going to work on in future, that also engineering students, science students, we have students from all over the world, know their rights, and that's something very important for me.
Yeah, finally, for me, it's really having voice, having control over your learning experience, and really give them the opportunity to get this control, because it's like when you talk about lifelong learning, it's beyond whatever they're doing with us during the 2, 3, 4 years. It's really building all these competencies to continue learning, because now, as we discussed before, learning is the work. So we need to help them develop these competencies and develop this confidence and really understanding how they can continue learning. So really teaching them how to learn. This is the main thing. Thank you.
There's one. Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, Tanya. There's one question from Ezgi, and I think I'm going to answer it very rapidly. Ezgi has been very, very active online. She's one of the public scholars this year. I think that taking opportunities to grow your network, to grow your voice, to learn to write to different audiences, and to expand your knowledge through various activities, not only courses, but also other events outside the university, building your network, writing to different audiences, and doing exactly what you're doing, Ezgi, is the way to go. So congratulations, and keep going. Thank you, Anna, and Tanya and Nadia, for this wonderful conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you, all three of you. We'll now go ahead and close the webinar and close the live stream for Montreal Connect. Folks, thanks for all of you for making the time for joining us. And we appreciate the connections that were made in this space. The three of you didn't all know one another at the start, and that was a very engaged conversation. So thank you for bringing all those ideas and perspectives to us in this way. We appreciate your time. A special shout out to Ann-Louise for putting all the work and leadership into making this conversation happen. We appreciate it. All right, folks, have a wonderful afternoon. We'll see you next time. For us, it's 3 p.m. for the next event. Join us back if you still happen to be online. For the rest of you, enjoy the rest of your day. I hear it's sunny out there, so have a good one. Thanks, everybody. Bye. Take care.